Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. We are coming to you live today on a Tuesday afternoon. Today is October 29th and a whole lot is being dumped on us all at once here in the sports world. Of course, last night we had the Game 3 of the World Series as the Dodgers took a commanding 3-0 lead over the Yankees. So we're going to be diving into that. Both the specifics of this game in particular and where things have gone wrong for the Yankees up to this point. We're also going to be talking about Russell Wilson being 2-0 as a Steelers starter this year, as the Steelers are now heading into the bye week very comfortably in the AFC. We'll talk about that game and all of the key takeaways there. We are then going to be breaking down and giving some thoughts on the news that just broke within the past hour of Anthony Richardson, the Colts starting quarterback, no longer, as he's being benched for Joe Flacco. We'll talk about sort of whether or not that is the right decision for the Colts, why they did arrive at this decision, and what it means for the future of Anthony Richardson with this Colts organization. And then in the latter half of the show, we're going to be doing a little bit of leftover takes from Week 8 in the NFL, as the Philadelphia Eagles are riding a little bit of a winning streak as well, as they were able to pull away from the Bengals late in that game. What does that say about the Eagles? Where do the Bengals stand? Is it possible for them to still make the playoffs? We'll be diving into that. And then finally, we are going to talk about all of the teams in the NFL with losing records, and we'll be mapping out which teams can carve out a path for themselves to still make the postseason. So a whole lot to dive into today. But before we do so, just remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports, as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the super chat feature that is available on YouTube, or you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker for our video audience at gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a tip or donation along with a comment, your comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Anything would be very greatly appreciated there. Last night, the Los Angeles Dodgers continued to roll over the Yankees as they were able to win 4-2 and take a 3-0 series lead in the World Series. And obviously, this World Series has not quite lived up to expectations in terms of two juggernauts facing off. Game 1 was, of course, a classic, but really since that Freddie Freeman walk-off homer in Game 1, this thing has been primarily all Dodgers. Now, neither one of Game 2 or Game 3 were necessarily blowouts. It was a 4-2 victory in each of the past two games. It's just a matter of the way that this has been playing out. It's been, a little bit of the worst concerns for Yankees fans coming into this series. The fact that they really haven't gotten much production out of anybody not named Juan Soto or Giancarlo Stanton, that continues to remain. Their biggest advantage, or at least thought biggest advantage coming into this series in terms of the differential in starting pitching, that hasn't necessarily panned out, where after a Garrett Cole, very solid start in Game 1, they haven't been getting that longevity out of their starting pitching performances that they were hoping to do. And now, while that hasn't directly been the reason why the Yankees are down in this series, in my opinion, it does make it that much more difficult for the Yanks to try and fight their way back into this, based off of the fact that they have had to overexpend, I suppose, their bullpen up to this point in the series. And now their bullpen has done a great job up to this point. In games 2 and 3, they have pitched 11 innings and allowed just one earned run. Now, obviously, a little bit of a controversial decision from Boone with that bullpen in Game 1, putting in Nestor Cortez for what ultimately resulted in the Freddie Freeman walk-off home run. But I do feel like the bullpen has kind of been holding their own for the Yanks up to this point in the series. It's just the continued lack of production from that offense. And on the other side, Dodgers are just playing clean baseball, and it's really spearheaded by, of course, Freddie Freeman, who seems like he is well on his way to winning World Series MVP. He stays hot with another home run last night in the first inning, a 2-run shot after Ohtani had been walked from the leadoff spot. We'll talk about Ohtani and where he stands with his injury momentarily here. But first, just want to give flowers to Freddie Freeman, who is now tied in World Series history for the most games consecutively with a home run. That is a total of 5 now, going back to 2021 when he was with Atlanta. And he has homered in each of the first 3 games of this series as well. So Freddie Freeman, just for where he was at in terms of that ankle injury and being able to work his way back. And, I think that MLB fans specifically, based off of the way that they have changed the postseason format in recent years, there's a lot of this sort of, debate around rest versus rust. That's something that we see in the NFL as well, in terms of, is it better to have maybe some momentum at your side going into these games, or can the rest be beneficial for you? Well, Freddie Freeman is certainly, and he's admitted that the rest has definitely been a huge cause for him being able to have this type of a series where we saw him really struggling, both, I would say, slightly in the field, and not even like a total lack of production, but physically you could see him laboring. You could see that he was having a very hard time, and he himself said that his ankle feels a lot better from last week to this week, and I do think that there is a pretty solid correlation there in terms of Freeman being healthier coming into this series. Momentum couldn't make up for that. And, it feels like online recently, for some reason, we've had a lot of debate as to whether or not momentum is real. I do think it's very real in the heat of the moment. And, the mental effects are certainly a real thing to take into consideration, but at the end of the day, the reason why rest is so important is because you get players like Freddie Freeman who are able to ice up a little bit longer, not have to exert themselves physically, get a little bit of time to heal up, and that has certainly been a huge help for the Dodgers. So Freddie Freeman, got to feel great for him at this point. A little bit of a cherry on top for what should be a Hall of Fame career. And the fact that he's producing at this level right now has been awesome to see from him. And you know what? He's been, you can argue, the missing piece for this Dodgers team. Now, the other missing piece, of course, is Shohei Ohtani, who is currently dealing with an injury. He dislocated his shoulder, it appears, late in Game 2. Definitely put a damper on the celebrations for the Dodgers coming out of Game 2. And yet, the rest of this team is just so productive. And, as for Ohtani himself, he's able to at least draw a couple walks in this game, one of them being hit by a pitch in the 9th inning. Just the fact that he is, there and present does instill fear in opposing pitchers the same way you don't want to pitch at him. That's why Clark Schmidt does allow the leadoff walk to begin this game, which turns a solo shot into a 2-run home run. But it's very clear that Shohei Ohtani is currently, dealing with this shoulder injury, and it's not necessarily going anywhere. The fact that he was wincing after some of his swings, you can see him standing on the base paths with his arms sort of hooked on his collar, almost in a de facto sling to try and relieve some of the tension on that shoulder. So it's one of those things where if you want to play the game of how can the Yankees work their way back into this series, it helps that Shohei Ohtani will probably, and who knows, the last thing you want to do is put limitations on Ohtani, because that's when you end up with egg on your face. But I don't think that this is an injury that is going to go away. I think it's very serious. If this wasn't the World Series, he would not be playing right now, at least in my opinion. I'm no medical expert. And I think it's something that if they can extend this thing a little longer, maybe we start to feel the effects of Ohtani struggling with this injury a little bit more. Now, again, if you want to talk about just the reason why the Dodgers have been able to overcome this despite Ohtani, specifically in this game. Like I mentioned, it's not like the Dodgers came out and absolutely, beat up on the Yankees. They won convincingly, I would say, with what was a 4-0 lead headed into the ninth inning. Ultimately, Rizzo gets on base. Verdugo hits a 2-run home run to make it a little bit closer, but it really felt like the Dodgers controlled this game all the way throughout. And really one of the biggest reasons, and maybe not even in particular this game, but just generally speaking, they're doing a lot of the little things right. You look at the fact that defensively, they have been excellent. You have the plays like I believe it was in the 4th inning of Mookie Betts, a little bit robbing, I suppose you could argue, a play in right field. I believe that was against Juan Soto. In the 4th inning as well, the Yankees, we've talked about it at length before, the base running issues that they've had. Obviously, the Giancarlo Stanton send, controversial, definitely. I think that, the general consensus is that it was a ridiculous call to send Stanton in that situation, knowing his limitations as a base runner, which is totally fair. For whatever it's worth, it was at a situation where the Yankees felt pretty desperate, I would argue, that at that point, they just needed something to build off of. You understand the reality of the situation with this Yankees lineup, where at that point it was Volpe at bat, and, he hits a single. For a lot of this series and a lot of this playoffs in general, really, since the ALDS, where you were getting a little bit more production from the bottom part of the lineup, the Yankees have been pretty much a two-man show. I think that Fox might have actually had specifically a graphic up at one point that called it a two-man band between Soto and Stanton. And, you get a good Stanton game last night as well, and he does continue to produce for you. You actually at least get some base runners on at the top of the lineup as well. Gleyber Torres drawing a couple walks. Aaron Judge does continue to struggle, of course, though. He ends up drawing a walk, but another strikeout in that 1st inning as well. You have this whole moment with Yankees fans giving a standing ovation to Aaron Judge to try and encourage him, get him back on the right track, and we are just not there yet right now. And, it's unfortunate given the fact that Judge is this incredible player and the stature of him is so great, but he's at this point, it's going to be at least another year where he is going to have the reputation of, somebody whose play drops off in the playoffs, where the strikeout numbers for him this postseason have been staggering. Believe it was Jay Hay of the Baseball is Dead podcast who said that he has 2 of the top 3 spots for Yankees franchise history of most strikeouts in a postseason. He has the number 1 and number 3 spots on this list, obviously for a very historic franchise. That is a terrible note to be on. And you do have to feel for Judge a little bit. The fact that, he's clearly in his head at this point as well. And he is on this struggle bus so much to the point where I don't think that there's anything he can really do at this point in the playoffs in terms of if you want to talk yourself into, well, how can the Yankees make things interesting here? They face off again. I believe it is tonight. Yeah, it is tonight that Game 4 will be taking place. This feels like, a Dodgers bullpen game, and we've seen in the past in an elimination setting against the Padres in the NLDS that, they have been able to stand up. This is a spot where you sort of have to get to the bullpen in this game, sort of knock them off their rocker a little bit. Make it to Game 5 where you have Garrett Cole at least on the mound to be able to, put up a fight for you. I don't feel great about it with Luis Gil pitching. We saw first time around, it wasn't, first time around being during the Guardians series, it wasn't a terrible start from him, but certainly not what is going to be championship winning baseball. So Gil in the biggest pitching moment of his life And I think this is going to be, it has to be, his second postseason appearance, unless he, came out of the bullpen at some point in the playoffs, which I don't believe that he did, that he's going to need to step up, get you to Gerrit Cole, and then really from there, it's who else is going to step up for this Yankees lineup, because it has been obviously a mess at this point. And specifically, I think it is relied in the fact that the Yankees have been so dependent on having just a couple guys really carry the overall load for them, where I specifically look back to the playoffs last year where the Rangers ultimately, hit their stride and were really able to muscle their way to a World Series win with power, with the home run ball, which is something that the Yankees have been very dependent on for a lot of the year, and even in the postseason so far, that we don't see them stringing together hits. It is about, just getting the long ball. The issue is that last year when the Rangers were able to win the World Series, they had 7 players hit multiple home runs. And right now the Dodgers currently are at 9 players who have hit multiple home runs. The Yankees have just 3. It's Giancarlo Stanton, Juan Soto, and Aaron Judge. And that's just not enough top to bottom production out of your lineup to the point where I just don't think it's a sustainable way to win baseball games on a regular basis. And you look at their path to the World Series, I'm not one to necessarily go the whole Mickey Mouse championship route or anything like that, but they were able to, sort of benefit from playing against these opposing teams that weren't exactly offensive threats. In the Royals more specifically, but the Guardians even still as well. I mean, this is the same Guardians team that eventually they were able to turn it on a little bit more heading into that series against the Yankees in the ALCS, but they had been going, I wonder if I still have it in my notes here. It was something like 18 scoreless innings in a row for the Guardians in the postseason. That's obviously, a terrible look and sends back a little bit, but that's the type of offense that the Yankees were facing off against, and they were able to sort of, with good pitching performances, which again, credit to their bullpen, which has been massively impressive. They have been able to win some of these, lower game shootouts and have just, the main part of their order come up in some of these big spots, most specifically Stanton, but, Judge, even when he has his flashes of life, one of them coming late in the game against the Guardians during that ALCS. So ultimately, I think that the series is most likely a wrap at this point. The Dodgers seem to have firm control, but, you can start to talk yourself into it a little bit in terms of pitching matchups. Bullpen game tonight for the Dodgers. You take that one. You have the advantage in Game 5 with Gerrit Cole. Either way, though, the offense is going to need to step up more for the Yankees, and you're going to need to get it from different angles. Of course, Aaron Judge is a part of that conversation. Everybody's been saying that really once Judge turns it on, everything changes. I still don't know if I would go quite that far, but, certainly his impact needs to be felt, and the bottom of that lineup, who can emerge for them? Is it a Rizzo? Did Verdugo find anything last night with that late swing? I would venture to guess no, but, we will see. I'm hoping that this game sort of goes in the favor of the Yankees so that we get more of a series here, but ultimately it seems like the Dodgers are just the best team in baseball, which they have been for years, and this feels like the year that finally they're going to be able to follow through with that. I know that they won in 2020 as well, but there is such that caveat with them that I feel for them a little bit, that this feels like the Dodgers' years, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. We are going to be switching gears to the NFL, where last night we had a Monday Night Football game between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New York Giants. So we are going to dive into that game, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement. The top is so vacant. I don't need shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it. The news if it's some losing shit. The stupid is you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be diving into the Monday Night Football matchup between the New York Giants and the Pittsburgh Steelers. As last night, the Steelers came out on top 26-18 as Russell Wilson improves to 2-0 on the season as the starting quarterback. Of course, took over in week 7 against the Jets, and overall, he has looked very, very solid up to this point. And it was at a point probably around the third quarter where I was kind of sitting around and, a lot of stagnancy from this Steelers offense. And I was wondering, all right, well, are we actually seeing Russell Wilson do anything particularly great to show that he really is an improvement over Justin Fields? And it was around that third quarter where he started making the throws downfield, throw to Pickens down the left sideline. He hits Calvin Austin for a touchdown, a 29-yard touchdown as well. And I do think that he sort of separated himself, because what I had been saying after their week 7 game against the Jets last week is that these 50-50 balls, he's sort of underthrowing them. I don't think that it's any degree of a throw that Justin Fields would be incapable of making. And ultimately, Russell Wilson, I do think, gave himself that edge with his performance late in this game. So that's all excellent. Russell Wilson seems like he is going to be the starter probably for the remainder of the season, as the Steelers are now 6-2, are going into a bye week, and really coming out of, the bye week next week, they need to sort of know what their identity is and who they are. So that is certainly, at least they're sort of figuring out that sense of it, of having the quarterback answer. Now, I'm just sort of speculating here. It's not like we've gotten a Mike Tomlin quote definitively saying that Wilson will be the starter moving forward for the remainder of this season. But I figure that is probably the logical order of events here. You wouldn't go back to Justin Fields, I feel like, given where, the Steelers offense has been over the course of the past couple weeks. That being said, I still have, some real concerns with the Steelers, where early on in this game, yet again, it was the negative plays that continued to hurt them. And, that's something that I think Justin Fields was struggling with as well. You want to talk about the red zone production from this Steelers team? All season long, it has been an issue for them to some degree. They are the 28th ranked team in red zone touchdown percentage in the NFL this season at just 46.4%. Now that's, at least in part due to the fact that last night they were 0 for 4. So that continues to be a very real struggle for them. And I don't think it's so much on the quarterback. I think that we continue to see some of these penalties pop up for them, which gets in the way for them. Last night, specifically, there was a penalty on right tackle Broderick Jones that ends up taking a Pickens touchdown off of the board. And we've seen, a couple times, I think it starts at the offensive line and just being able to having their struggles at certain moments, which puts them behind the sticks, and ultimately Wilson, Fields, whoever you want to have at quarterback, it's just not necessarily a form of offense that's going to be able to overcome everything, especially when the reality of the situation is the Steelers don't exactly have a ton of super dynamic, perimeter threats. Now, George Pickens, certainly a great player. We saw a lot of good from Van Jefferson, I thought, last night as well. Calvin Austin, that we can say that these players had good games. I still don't think it's a situation, though, where it's, these elite playmakers with the ball in their hands that are able to sort of make something out of nothing when you are consistently putting yourself behind the sticks. Now, Najee Harris has been incredible, which is also something that I do want to hit on in all of this as well, is because Najee and the emergence that he had, I would really point to that game against the Raiders that's when he had an 106-yard game with a touchdown. He's had 3 consecutive games of over 100 yards. So, yeah, that probably is the turning point. It's not just the yards total themselves. It's the way that he's been able to sort of bounce off of defenders. He's hitting the holes right. He's picking up extra yards after contact. I think that he's been very impressive and somebody that, has to some degree, been sort of dumped on by a lot of the NFL community. I think in large part due to his draft stature of being a first-round pick a few years ago. And now we are seeing, I don't know if I would call it necessarily, justification for taking him in the first round, but he is a very talented runner of the football. And it's been a huge element for the Steelers where I like I've mentioned all season long, I've had some concerns with their offensive line on the season as a whole. And now, you look at the Steelers, even if they're not excellent in pass pro, they have put together what is currently a top 10 rushing offense in the NFL in terms of yards per game. They're sitting at 8th with 138.1. So I think that that's definitely something to hang your hat on if you are Arthur Smith. And of course, Arthur Smith, if you have been following him since Tennessee, really one of his primary goals has been, and obviously having Derrick Henry is a huge part of that, but the fact that, he wants to establish the run and he wants to be able to build off of that with play action as a result. And I do think that that's something that we are seeing from the Steelers offense a little bit more. Plus you add the fact that Russell Wilson has been able to hit some of these deep shots. I've certainly been impressed, and I'm eating crow a little bit on this one. Do I think that the Steelers offense is now magically fixed with Russell Wilson at the helm? I do not. And again, going over in the red zone in terms of scoring touchdowns is a part of that conversation. I think it stems a little bit beyond that as well. Again, just some of these mental mistakes. And I really do think it stems from the offensive line, not to sort of bury them or overemphasize the point, but I think that that's still, a bit of an issue for them. And the fact that Russell Wilson, as much as this introduction of those deep shots into the offense is certainly very important for the continued development of this Arthur Smith offense in Pittsburgh, I still have some doubts in terms of, especially when it comes to those red zone possessions. And usually I rely on Next Gen Stats for some of their passing charts. I'm a big fan of the work that they do. They don't have the exact breakout of Russell Wilson's performance last night, something that was noticeable to me coming out of the Week 7 matchup is sort of something that I additionally talked about earlier in the year with Justin Fields, that in each of Wilson and Fields' first starts, we saw very little action over the middle of the field, in or around the hash marks in the center of the field. I didn't necessarily get the, impression that they were attacking the middle of the field all that much last night either against the Giants. So, I could be off base there. Again, don't necessarily have the chart in front of me on that one, but I think that that's when you start to see some of those instances in the red zone where things get dicey. These aren't receivers that can, very easily create separation. It's not like you have a lot of jump ball threats or anything like that. I think that they do sort of need a different playmaker on the perimeter. That being said, I don't really think one is available to them. Really, the two wide receiver names that had been sort of getting shopped around were Deontay Johnson and Christian Kirk. Kirk is now out for the remainder of the season, so that's not an option for the Steelers. And because Pittsburgh traded Deontay Johnson just this past offseason, they are not eligible to trade back for him. So I don't think that those reinforcements are coming for the Steelers necessarily anytime soon. So I kind of think that this is just who they are. And again, to sort of one last time, I'll say to correct that, I think it starts with not putting yourself behind the sticks. That offensive line has got to be better, be more heads up to, stop getting in their own way. And, if they can just, get clean plays. Like I mentioned, you have a George Pickens touchdown that was wiped off of the board. Like that is something that is so easily fixable in terms of just handling the pressure better up front. But overall, the Steelers are a good team. They're 6-2. I still definitely am sitting in this position and thinking I am, probably early leaning towards whoever the Steelers play in the playoffs. I feel like it's going to be a bet against them situation. Now, the fact that the Ravens lost this past weekend and the Steelers were able to take the lead in that division is definitely helpful. I'd feel better about them if they are playing at Heinz Field relative to having to go on the road to somewhere like Buffalo or Kansas City or wherever they may end up as a wild card team. If they're able to hold on to this division, that is a huge help for them, of course. Now, on the other side of this game, with the Giants, it's just kind of what you would expect from the Giants. This was a game, we talked about it yesterday, just the fact that their offense probably wasn't going to be able to put up enough points to cover that 6 points, which they were not. They at least got 18 points out of it, and specifically the run game looked very good for them with Tyrone Tracy. He's certainly brought in an extra level of dynamic ability relative to what Devin Singletary was giving them early on. Not that Singletary is a bad running back at this point either, but Tyrone Tracy has been an upgrade in my opinion, the way that he's able to fight for extra yards and such, and some of that speed that he shows as well. Now, the other part of this as well, the other side of it, as much as you want to credit the Giants, I have mentioned the Steelers defense hasn't really been as elite as you might think. It is the Steelers and, the brand and everything behind it, but ultimately they have kind of been gettable, at least to some degree. Last night they allowed 394 yards to the Giants. That's not a great mark for them. Now, if you look across the board, their overall stats are pretty good. They are a top 10 team in terms of yards allowed per game. Specifically in the run game, they have been excellent. So last night was a little bit indicative, and maybe I'm getting caught up too much in some of the Steelers' primetime performances, which is certainly possible. I don't think that they looked good in the Sunday Night Football game against the Cowboys in week 5. So maybe that's really what's just, sort of living rent-free in my head a little bit too much. But I don't know. I think we've seen at least cracks from this Steelers defense. Now, Alex Highsmith is back for them at least, and he is going to be able to provide some extra pressure up front for them. We're seeing young players, Beanie Bishop with another interception last night, so that is encouraging as well. But something about this Steelers defense doesn't make me think that this is a team that can go and sort of pitch a shutout against some real playoff caliber teams. Now, ultimately, we'll see when it comes around here, but the Giants were in this game much longer than it should have been. They had the ball with a chance to tie this one up at the end of the game. And I just feel like with how this game played out, it really should not have been that way. But Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. Am I being too critical on the Steelers? Definitely be sure to let me know. But we're now going to be diving into the news that just broke earlier this afternoon that the Indianapolis Colts are planning to bench young quarterback Anthony Richardson for the veteran in Joe Flacco after what was a pretty bad performance against the Texans this past week, and specifically some antics within the game that I think probably rubbed the locker room the wrong way. So we'll be talking about why they made this decision, what the future looks like, and is this going to help them in, for the season moving forward. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be diving into the news that broke within the past hour that the Indianapolis Colts are benching young quarterback Anthony Richardson for Joe Flacco moving forward this season. Richardson, of course, drafted 4th overall just last year in the 2023 draft. He only has 10 starts to his name, and already seems like it might be up in the air as to whether or not he will remain a Colt for the long-term future. This comes on the heels of what was a pretty discouraging performance against the Texans this past week. He was 10 of 32 for 175 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. I'll start by saying that there is, a lot of the incompletions, it's a very bad look. There were some drops in there, so I suppose, the tape would maybe look a little bit better than what the box score would actually show. Specifically, I thought from Dan Orlovsky that I'll give him credit for, some of the drops not going his way, but overall, it is just the continued bad decision making, along with the fact that there really isn't a semblance of, methodical drives to Anthony Richardson's game, that it's too much boom or bust to the point where I do think it hurts this Colts offense as a whole. So, really the worst play of the game for Richardson, and in terms of just a football IQ standpoint, did come at the end of the first half, where there was a situation, there was about 40 seconds left in the half. The Colts were backed up within their own 15-yard line, and Anthony Richardson takes a shot to the sideline for Michael Pittman Jr., and that play was almost intercepted by Kamari Lassiter. At that point, this is a 10-10 football game. Feel like, okay, you just got away with not throwing an interception there. Let's just, run this clock out, get to the second half in a 10-10 game. Well, that didn't happen. In large part, Anthony Richardson definitely deserves blame. He ends up throwing an interception on what looked like a hitch route to Josh Downs in traffic. Jalen Petrie ends up picking it off, and CJ Stroud ends up throwing a touchdown pass to Tank Dell to take it from a tie game going into half to a 7-point lead with momentum vastly shifting in the other direction. That at that point, definitely a bad decision on Anthony Richardson. I'd also put a lot of bad decision making on Shane Steichen there. The Colts lined up with an empty backfield, just Anthony Richardson back there. No real threat of running outside of maybe an Anthony Richardson, quarterback power or draw or something along those lines. And I think that, given who Anthony Richardson has been as a player up to this point in the year, the fact that he has been dealing with turnovers, I thought that was an insane decision by Steichen as well, who I do think deserves some ridicule as well. But that's obviously one of the big plays. The other one that is probably the most notable in terms of what has gained traction, in the media since then, and probably plays a huge reason as to, or at least a significant reason as to why Anthony Richardson was benched this week, because there was the situation in the third quarter where ultimately it was the opening drive, I believe, when the Colts were outside of the red zone. Might not have been opening drive, might have been second drive of the second half, where Richardson on second and goal, at this point it's outside the 20-yard line because of a penalty, but he ends up, breaking out of a sack, ultimately getting tackled for no gain, and he taps himself out of the play. Joe Flacco comes in for one play, and Anthony Richardson, after the game, said that he was tired and that he needed a break. Both of those, his own words. And it's a terrible look. It really is. And there is a group of fans who are saying, after the game, trying to defend Anthony Richardson for this. I think the most important words come from the Colts captain, offensive lineman, Ryan Kelly, who he spoke out to the media, said that he had a conversation with Anthony Richardson privately and let him know that what he did of asking out of that game at that point was unacceptable for the standard of an NFL starting quarterback. He said, quote, "I think he knows that's not the standard he needs to play up to and the rest of the team holds him to." And then Kelly also added, quote, "I know he's right. He's going to take some criticism for that, and rightfully so. That's a tough look." Now, I don't think Kelly was saying this to the media to air out his business or anything. I'm not trying to extrapolate quotes there from what he was saying, but it clearly rubbed at least Ryan Kelly and probably others on this Colts team the wrong way. The fact that Anthony Richardson, I have never seen anything like that, a quarterback, asking out. And, Anthony Richardson, with a lot of the decision making with something like this, I think that the inexperience has been very clear up to this point, that he is somebody who I think coming into this season had only played 17 games after high school. You look at the overall numbers, I believe he had played just 13 games in college, and now he's at 10 games in the NFL. So a very small sample size for a player who is still very young. He turned 22 years old this past May. So there is, you would think in theory a lot of time for him to sort of grow into being an NFL quarterback. The Colts were kind of stuck in this tough position though, where you have a situation like that where I think it probably really rubbed the locker room wrong. Steichen, who hasn't necessarily, I do think he's a good offensive-minded coach. He hasn't necessarily established himself yet in Indy. And, I was initially planning on talking about this subject anyways today, even prior to the news that, he has officially been benched. And it's up to Steichen at this point I do think that the long-term sort of better option for the Colts would be to stick with Anthony Richardson and give him more of a chance here and, trial by fire and such. But Steichen has a responsibility to himself as trying to hold on to his job and to the locker room as a whole of getting your team to be invested in the vision as to what is going on. And I do think that it probably got to a point during, the locker room after this past weekend and, had been building up a little bit, that it is probably a hard sell to that locker room that Richardson gives you a better chance to win on a game-to-game basis than what Joe Flacco has done. Flacco, and not necessarily just based off of his Colts career, he's only played he's only started 2 games since then. He's 1-1, but in that time as well. Or he only started one game, which they lost against the Jaguars, but he came in relief against the Steelers and looked pretty good then. He helped put up 34 points in the loss against the Jaguars the week after, as Richardson was dealing with that hip injury. And it's a bad situation as a whole. I do feel like ultimately, Anthony Richardson, there's a chance that he could still be in play moving forward as the Colts franchise quarterback. He is still so young. Like, you look at somebody like a Sam Darnold who was, just obliterated when he was with the Jets. He was drafted as a young prospect, and overall, the situation was so bad. The temperature was so hot within the Jets, media organization and everything, that Darnold, who at the time that they drafted him, I believe was just 21 years old, that timing just didn't add up. And now eventually, years later, we're seeing Sam Darnold, sort of show some of those flashes that the believers in him did have. For Anthony Richardson, though, I think at this point for this season, again, it's a really hard sell that he gives you a better chance to win football games than Joe Flacco. So it's just sort of trying to balance the, temperature from the locker room based versus the temperature from the front office, because I'm sure the front office would prefer to play this out in the long run, continue to get Anthony Richardson reps, because a lot of the mistakes I do think are avoidable. Even the little things, such as on that final drive when the Colts were still in the game, which they were despite a lot of bad from Anthony Richardson, the not getting out of bounds. They had gotten that final drive with 50 seconds left, and Anthony Richardson took up 23 of them because he scrambled and didn't get out of bounds. Like, cutting your time in half, based off of one play, just, you have to be smarter about things like that. A lot of these interceptions, specifically the one when you go back to the Bears a handful of weeks ago, the interception that he had in the red zone, just sort of lobbing one up while he was under pressure. Just a ridiculous decision there, and that's what we get a lot of out of Anthony Richardson. And it's not like it's all bad with him. Of course, there is the inherent athletic ability with Richardson that is definitely fascinating for a lot of NFL fans, of what type of a dual threat offense could Anthony Richardson run if he's able to clean up his game. He has those deep shots sort of built in with the athleticism of him. He has an incredible arm talent. He can take those deep shots. And even in this game, there were a lot of deep shots in this game. I think 2 of them could have gone for touchdowns. You have, I think it was specifically in the third quarter, where he ended up taking a deep shot down the left sideline to Tyler Goodson, their running back. He ends up dropping that one. What does Anthony Richardson do the very next play? He takes a shot down the right sideline for Josh Downs for, a big pickup there, ultimately down at the 1 yard line. They're able to punch it in from there. Even earlier in the game, Richardson, I think it might have been on their first or second drive, he took a deep shot to Adonai Mitchell in the red zone, in the end zone, down the right sideline, and, he couldn't get a second foot in bounds. Like, both of those to Goodson and Mitchell were very good balls, and same with the throw to Downs as well. Like, you still do have those plays involved, but I think part of the issue with it is they feel so reliant on those deep shots. Generally speaking, there is no short to intermediate game with this Colts offense from a passing standpoint, and that is very disappointing. And it feels like they have to sort of rely so heavily on a lot of these deep shots that just doesn't feel like a sustainable way to maintain drives. And that's why I think it was coming out in the second half. At one point during the game, they had 3 straight 3-and-outs, where just unacceptable there. And it's not all on Anthony Richardson, I suppose, but this is not a bad Colts team, generally speaking. Their offense overall is pretty functional. I think there's a lot of talent on that offense. The defense had an excellent game, actually, just sort of moving players on that Houston front line as well. 11 tackles for loss by this Colts defense. They had, 11 from 7 different players as well. It's not, this defense hasn't been elite performing by any point at this year, but, something to build off there. And then on the other end, you have Anthony Richardson, where there was a stat that they put out, CBS Sports did. Anthony Richardson currently has the lowest completion percentage among qualified quarterbacks in the last 20 years at 44.4. That's below 2011 Tim Tebow, 2009 Jamarcus Russell, and 2005 J.P. Lossman. So that's very bad company for Anthony Richardson. And again, I do think that there's upside there. I've been pretty adamant that the last thing I want to do is sort of, prey on the downfall of a 22-year-old quarterback with all of this talent. But I've been kind of repeatedly saying I just don't see him as NFL ready right now. And, when you think back on this as well, it feels like Richardson, if they were going to, and I'm sure this wasn't the plan, but if they were going to have such a quick trigger with Richardson moving off from him, it just feels like they should have had another plan in place at the time that they drafted him to be a bridge quarterback. Because now I just feel like it totally impacts the psyche of Richardson now. And I think that this is something that he can overcome. Again, still just 22 years old. I think that there is room to grow from here, but massively disappointing, obviously, the way that this thing is all played out for him and for Indianapolis. But that being said, Colts are 4-4 right now and are very much in play for a playoff spot. So I probably would have opted to give him more time, but I have to imagine behind the scenes the pressure was probably heating up for Steichen and this, within the locker room to, okay, this guy is clearly not as good right now as Joe Flacco, so kind of have to make the move. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. It's a really weird, I think, layering of different perspectives when you get down to this. At the core of things, if Steichen was on the brink of losing this locker room, I think it's the right decision. And that's kind of what I assume based off of some of the context clues, that that's the way this thing played out. But again, Richardson, I don't think the Colts are going to be in any rush to trade him. They probably go into next season with him on the roster competing for that starting job, and we'll see how things play out from there. It's definitely been disappointing up to this point, but I do feel like, there's a way to salvage this. But as of right now, the Colts are just kind of full throttle here with Joe Flacco, who came in relief of Deshaun Watson last season and led the Browns to the playoffs. Will he be able to do so with the Colts this year? We will see. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. But I want to dive into some of the other action from this past weekend in the NFL that we weren't able to dive into yesterday, as the Philadelphia Eagles have now built up a quiet 3-game winning streak after they were able to pull away late in the game against the Bengals last week to ultimately win 37-17. I want to talk about what this means for the Eagles. Are they building something here? And then on the other end of this, with the Bengals, is their season now over after what has been a very slow start to the year? We're going to be answering all of those questions, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be just doing a little bit of leftovers from this past weekend in the NFL, as I want to talk about the game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Philadelphia Eagles from this past weekend, and where the Eagles were able to pull away late in this one thanks to their defense more than anything else to defeat the Bengals 37-17. If you didn't catch any of this game, it would look like a blowout. kind of felt that way down the stretch of this game, but with 4 minutes left in the third quarter, this was still a tied game at 17-17. Jalen Hurts ends up linking up with Devontae Smith on a deep shot for a touchdown then. And then really from there on out, I thought it was excellent defense from Philadelphia, where I have sort of had my doubts with Philly's defense, and ultimately, they're starting to turn out some good performances where, the entire game sort of turned around as well after that Smith touchdown, sort of for starters, but really it was at that point, Bengals felt like they were reeling a little bit. Very interesting decision by Bengals head coach Zach Taylor to go for it on fourth down as opposed to just settling for a 3-and-out. I think that it's very indicative, and we're going to dive into the Bengals part of this later, but I think it's pretty indicative on the fact that he had very little confidence that they were going to be there, that the Bengals defense was going to be able to hold up against Philly that was heating up at that point. So it was a 4th and short. It was Jamar Chase in the backfield, motioning back and forth, ultimately sprinting out to the right, and Eagles rookie cornerback Cooper DeJean, who was able to follow him all the way there, make the play out on the perimeter for a tackle for loss, and ultimately that set the Eagles up in scoring position again. They ended up having to settle for a field goal after that, but it was the defense once again coming up huge, where on the Bengals' next drive, it was backup cornerback inserted into the lineup, Isaiah Rodgers, making an excellent play in coverage versus Jamar Chase once again, being able to jump up, swat the ball backwards and into the arms of CJ Gardner-Johnson. That along with a fumble later on in the game, the Eagles, again, in that final quarter and a half, not even, were able to turn the Bengals over twice, plus a turnover on downs as well. So that's kind of what led to Philly being able to, close this game out and pull away late, because it did look like we were in for a pretty good finish up until their defense specifically, stepped up for them. And I think that is super encouraging for the Eagles, where up to this point in the year, I think that I've been a little bit back and forth in terms of how legitimate this Eagles team is. They were able to pick up wins in each of the past couple weeks against what were some pretty poor offenses, I suppose, on the other side of things. And it's funny because you can say the exact same thing for the Bengals, where each of these teams in their past 2 games faced off against the Cleveland Browns and the New York Giants. I believe I'm right on that one. And in both of those situations, you're talking about offenses in Cleveland and in New York that neither one of them are exactly threatening. So, I was a little bit more so sort of on the trend of the Bengals. Not really sure what to make of that. The Eagles, same could be said there, but being able to shut down this Bengals offense is impressive. Now, it's important to also note that T. Higgins was not available for the Bengals, and really when that's the case, and again, not to take anything away from the Eagles here, but the Bengals, they are already inherently a pretty one-dimensional team. I would argue that the running game has not been there for them this season. It looked like at one point Chase Brown, as he took over the lead back spot in Cincinnati, that maybe they were going to be able to establish the ground game a little bit more. Certainly was not the case in this game or last week either, as Chase Brown has not really lived up to those expectations. If you're a fantasy owner, you at least got the touchdown out of this performance to make it look a little bit better for him. But Chase Brown, just 32 yards on 12 carries, not the efficiency that they're looking for. And you take T. Higgins out of the situation as well, and it's mostly Jamar Chase or bust. And that's kind of the way this game went down, is Jamar Chase was so involved in that first half. He had the touchdown that he scored in the first half. And then really from there, like I just mentioned, each of those turnovers, late in the third quarter, early in the fourth, came off of Joe Burrow sort of in this Bengals offense in general, trying to force feed it to Jamar Chase, which I understand this decision, and I can't say that it's wrong of them by any means, but it's not how you want your team to operate as a whole, is basically just having one playmaker on the outside. Now, Mike Gesicki at least, was involved in terms of, 7 catches for 73 yards. He also had the fumble late in the game as well, though, to sort of, definitively put them out of this game. So just, the Bengals roster construction over this past year or so has certainly been questionable in terms of the way that things have actually panned out for them. Just weird to think about how much of a loaded offense they were with, the best trio of receivers in the league, probably, with Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and can't believe I'm blanking on the third name there. Not Auden Tate, who I did like as well, but it was now Titans wide receiver, whatever. I'm going to look this up in a second. I'm going to be mad at myself for not knowing the name. Tyler Boyd, of course. And going from that to what is kind of, again, just Jamar Chase or bust, I do think that T. Higgins has looked good when he's been available for them up to this point in the season as well. So I'm not entirely out on the Bengals. I mean, they sit at 3-5. We're going to be talking shortly here about, teams that have losing records up to this point in the year, whether or not they can sort of turn things around to make a potential playoff run. But the Bengals, it just feels like, I don't know, they're just kind of waiting to fall apart, and anything to Joe Burrow or Jamar Chase would be entirely detrimental for them. But again, I do want to sort of, before we get into all of that, talk about the Eagles here and what this streak of 3 straight wins means for them. Feels like, the entire media was sort of dumping on them early on in the season, specifically after that Falcons loss. And then, on top of that as well, they had the game against the Saints, where basically they almost coached themselves out of that game despite what was a largely dominant performance. And then following that one up with a blowout loss to the Buccaneers, that it was a very rough stretch, and they certainly deserved all of the criticism that they got. Maybe not all of it. I know that some people probably got carried away with it. But for the Eagles, I do still think that they are a very good roster, at least on paper. And what I have come to appreciate, at least, with this game against the Bengals, is that we saw at least a little bit more emphasis in terms of early on getting Saquon Barkley involved. That was something that drove me crazy. And, that being said, Eagles did go yet another game without scoring a point in the first quarter, which is concerning to some degree. I mean, they at least were trying to run with Barkley a little bit more. And, ultimately they didn't score in the first quarter. That being said, they did score on their first drive. It just happened to be that the Bengals' opening drive took up over 10 minutes. So I'm not really going to ding the Eagles on that. I mean, for narrative's sake, if you want to keep pushing that the Eagles are yet to score in the first quarter, by all means, go ahead. I'm giving them a little bit of a pass on this one, where ultimately they got Saquon involved early on, and again, paid dividends for them, that they were able to sort of establish the ground game early, move the ball, and not just get into a point where it's just sort of solely the Jalen Hurts taking deep shots show. And specifically, the offensive line hadn't been holding up for them either. They, in this game, still missing 2 of their starting offensive linemen in Jordan Mailata and in Mekhi Becton, which is almost, a little bit more harmful to the look of the Cincinnati Bengals at this point as well, considering the fact that they only hit Jalen Hurts once. They didn't sack him at all. So I think that that's definitely a concern if you're looking yourselves in the mirror with Cincinnati. But, I think that that's kind of more the recipe for the Eagles. And that's where you can add in the Jalen Hurts deep shots a little bit more. You have 2 ultra-talented wide receivers in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith that, you can get away. I wouldn't even say get away. Like, that is something that is an element to your offense that you can utilize. I just feel like it has to be centered around Saquon Barkley, and it kind of was, and ultimately it got the results for them. 22 carries, 108 yards for Saquon Barkley. No touchdowns for him. A couple of those tush pushes, especially coming off of a lot of the hard work Saquon did. Not that if you're a fantasy football owner, surely you're upset. Saquon Barkley himself seems to enjoy running the tush push, and he's on board with it as well. So Jalen Hurts finishes this game with 3 touchdowns on the ground. One of them just coming on a straight up scramble. So it's not like he's totally grifting off of those tush pushes, but overall, I do think that the Eagles are sort of on their way back towards being in semi-contention. The fact that, a lot of people had been ready to be all in on the Commanders, and that the Eagles were were now, little brother to them. I think we just got really excited with the Commanders early on in the season, and as we should be. They are still, I believe, leading this division in terms of standings as of right now, that they're 6-2, the Eagles are 5-2, but it's going to come down to when these teams actually faced off against one another. I can double check here the schedule to see when exactly that would be. I know they still do have both of their matchups coming up. It looks like we got first version of that week 11, Thursday Night Football, should be a bit of an interesting one there, but you know what? Eagles definitely on the right track, at least. And I think that they've sort of come to terms with what their identity is offensively, running the ball. And then on the other side, they just need passable enough defense, which, we have seen from them really going on basically the entire season, honestly, outside of, week 1 against Green Bay, which is a weird game. Their defense has been above average for the most part. Even in some of the losses as well. Tampa Bay game, not so much, but at this point, 7-game sample size, you take 5 good defensive performances, I think you take that any day. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. Like I mentioned, I want to talk about the Bengals and where they currently stand at 3-5, and I want to look at all the teams across the NFL with losing records and just sort of theorizing on which teams could end up making some playoff runs still, despite disappointing first halves of the season. So we're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we were just talking about the Bengals falling this past weekend against the Eagles after it seemed like they had been building up some momentum. They had a chance to get back to 500. Instead, they end up collapsing late in that game to fall to 3-5. And I want to talk about them and just the overall landscape of the NFL as a whole right now in terms of teams that are sub 500 and have a chance to make the playoffs. So we'll start with the Bengals because I do think that pretty clearly they are, I wouldn't say pretty clearly. There's one other team that rivals them for the best sub 500 team right now, but I do think that in the AFC right now, the wild card spot is very much open and up for grabs right now. I think that the current teams sitting in there are the Ravens, the Broncos, and the Chargers, I believe. I can double check myself on that one. I think that it's pretty clear the second place in the AFC North is going to be a playoff spot. Whether it is the Ravens or the Steelers, probably the top wild card spot at that. And then, yes, it is the Broncos and the Chargers as the other two teams right now. Colts in the hunt, Bengals in the hunt. Theoretically, the Dolphins are in this conversation as well. But I want to start by talking about the Bengals and, what needs to happen for them to be able to turn their season around. We've been talking about this, basically from early on in the season that they have chances to sort of turn themselves back around. After that loss to Baltimore, we said 2 very winnable games in the Giants and the Browns. They got both of those done. Then from there, I think that we said they can lose one of the 2 games of either against the Eagles or against the Ravens. And, additionally in there, they're probably going to have to beat the Raiders and the Chargers to continue making this push here. If they are able to, get through, realistically, the stretch was within those 4 games of week 8 to week 11, they had to win 3 out of the 4. Well, they just lost the first, meaning that they probably need to go 3-0 headed into this bye week to be back in the thick of things, because they are going to have some, decently tough matchups ahead. Because if they can get to week 12, in the 6-5, 5-6 range, they're going to have 2 games against the Steelers, 1 game on the road against the Cowboys. Titans are a pretty easy one in there. And then, a Browns team that can play them tough. They did play the Bengals tough just a couple weeks ago. That was with Deshaun Watson in at quarterback. Maybe there's a little bit of rejuvenation with Jameis Winston now under center. And then the Bengals also have the Broncos on the schedule, which is a team they're going to be directly competing with in order to make the playoffs. So ultimately, where this is at, I think that, losing this game to the Eagles really does feel pretty detrimental. The fact that, again, you're going to need likely 9 wins to be able to make the playoffs. I think it's possible. If I were to, have to force pick my way through the remainder of the season, I think the games that I would have them, definitively losing is at Baltimore, 1 against the Steelers, and then, that's kind of it in terms of, games I feel right now, at least strongly, that they may lose. That would be good enough to 9-7. The issue is the Bengals have sort of been unable to win a lot of these 50-50 games, and not even 50-50 games, because they were, 2 of the biggest... They suffered 2 of the biggest upset losses already this season against the Patriots and against the Commanders. So you're already putting yourself behind the 8 ball on that one. And from here on out, I mean, it feels kind of hard for me to imagine that they can pull their way back into this. But like I mentioned, I also don't really like the teams that they're competing with in the wild card. Now, I will say not a team that we're going to dive into in depth here because A, we already talked about them a little bit, and B, they don't have a losing record. I do like the Colts more now that they're starting Joe Flacco than I did prior with Anthony Richardson. So all of a sudden, I have more respect for what the Colts could potentially be this year. Outside of that, in the AFC, the only other team you can really talk yourself into is the Miami Dolphins now with Tua Tagovailoa back at quarterback. And I just think it's going to be too little too late. Losing last week against the Cardinals late in that one, I think is, they really needed that game to get back on track because they're a team that I think has a lot of difficult games. We're not going to go through their entire schedule necessarily, but game against the Bills, game against the Rams, game against the Packers, the Niners, the Texans, and 2 against the Jets. I mean, I just don't think that's a favorable schedule for the Dolphins to pull their way back into it. So I think the Bengals are at least in play here. Outside of that, in the AFC, I think the teams that are under 500, we can pretty much cross them off already. In the NFC, I think that really there's one team in particular that stands out to me, and that is the Los Angeles Rams. And that's the team that I was sort of alluding to earlier, that they sort of clearly, in my opinion, have the best chance to be able to, pull something out here and end off making a postseason run. They're currently 3-4. It seemed like this was, a disastrous season waiting to happen for them based off of all of the injuries that they sustained, both from the receivers and the offensive line early on in the year. And yet here they are, somehow still hanging around here. And being able to win that game last Thursday against the Vikings feels like it's a huge momentum shifter, where at that point, we were talking about Cooper Kupp rumors of him potentially being moved, whether, no matter how real or, fantasy those rumors were, it at least was a conversation that was being had. They'd be sitting here at 2-5 today in a very bad situation. The Rams now, though, we talked about this at length on Friday, the fact that they now are theoretically a game within their own division, despite what a bad start it was. Now, a loss to the Cardinals maybe makes things interesting in there, but they also beat the 49ers. So, being 1-1, I believe it is, in that division, you could be a lot worse off based off of how things were feeling for the Rams early on. It was, that late game comeback that was crazy against the 49ers early on this season that sort of almost now a couple weeks later feels like it could be a huge reason for them having a turning point despite being sub 500. And, I think that this is another thing that we talked about as well a little bit yesterday, that the Bears, as much as I am a believer in that team, specifically in the defense that I have been blown away with over the course of, at this point, call it a year-ish. It was around the trade deadline last year after adding Sweat that they really started rearing into form. I think that they have done an excellent job once again so far this season, that the Bears are sort of in contention there. But I think that they are ultimately going to drop out. I think that we're likely going to see 2 NFC North teams still, or 3 NFC North teams, specifically Lions, Packers. I would just about lock them into the playoffs. The Vikings are the team, and I don't want to be disrespectful because this season's been incredible for the Vikings up to this point. But I don't think it would be the most shocking thing in the world if they did sort of fall moving forward. That's not what I'm projecting necessarily, but I do feel like, we've seen some of the limitations with specifically Sam Darnold in that offense, and now with Christian Darrisaw out for the season. Not that I want to pin it solely on Sam Darnold, but he's going to be under more pressure and under more fire this year after, his starting blindside tackle is out for the remainder of the season. You're lying to yourself if you say that that's going to have zero impact moving forward this year. Their defense, there are some holes, specifically in the secondary, I think, that can be exposed if you go up against the Sean McVays and, the offensive innovators of the world. The Vikings still have, some divisional games on the horizon that are certainly going to be difficult. What I will say for them is their out-of-division schedule, I think, is light enough that I do feel pretty good about the Vikings still making the playoffs. All of this to be said, when you're talking about the Rams and what their best path is, I think it's probably going to have to be through the division, because it's revolving around, the Vikings and one of the Commanders or Eagles to fall out of this. I think all of those teams are quality teams, and that wild card spot is going to be super hard to sort of fly by. It's about the division right now, where the Cardinals are leading right now. The Cardinals did, in fact, lay it on the Rams when they met in week 2 of the season as well. That's going to, technically they're behind the Cardinals, and right now they have the leg up on the Rams because of that head-to-head matchup. I don't really see the Cardinals being, and I was very high on the Cardinals coming into the season, but I don't see them necessarily closing this out in elite fashion. There's just too much game-to-game sort of variance in terms of what version of this team are you going to get. That's not something I want to hitch my wagon to. It's really about the 49ers, I think. And yes, the Seahawks are in that mix as well. I mean, all of these teams are largely even. I do still think it's the 49ers division. I think that we saw a pretty convincing performance against the Cowboys. I know it was a little bit of a slow start, and I know that the Cowboys made things interesting a little bit late. I'm not saying that the 49ers are untouchable in this division, which is why I do think that that's kind of the Rams' best path into making the playoffs, is because I think with all the injuries that the 49ers have sustained, the Rams could find a way to sort of climb into this thing through the division. When you look at the Rams' schedule moving forward for this season, trying to come back from a 3-4 start, they're going to have obviously a handful more divisional games on their schedule. They have the Seahawks this upcoming week to sort of start that one off. Their out-of-division schedule, I mean, they do have the Eagles in there, which could end up being a huge game for them, and they do have the Bills in there, but ultimately, it's kind of just about winning your divisional games. I think that that's what it's going to bake down to at this point. I'm not worried about the Rams facing off against teams necessarily like the Dolphins or the Patriots or the Saints, or really the Jets either. This is going to be divisional games throughout, really, for the Rams, and I do think that it's very much possible. I would still lean with the 49ers for the NFC West, but anything can happen, obviously, especially when, the Niners are the team that currently are dealing with all of these injuries, as the Rams are seemingly getting a little bit healthier, but obviously Christian McCaffrey is going to have something to say about that as well. Same with Dre Greenlaw, so should be very interesting to watch. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content, and we will be back tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern, same time as always. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit.